Keanu stood in the first-class line, dressed simply, just a plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and a backpack that had clearly seen the world. Next to him, a man in an expensive suit watched with disdain, unable to hide his arrogance. "First class, huh?" The man muttered with a smirk. What happened next would leave everyone on that plane speechless and change one life forever. Los Angeles International Airport was alive with movement. People hurried past each other. Flight announcements echoed over the intercom, and the sound of rolling luggage filled the air. It was a place where time never seemed to slow down. Everyone was in a rush, focused on getting to their destinations. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because we have more inspiring stories coming your way. Among the chaos, in the first-class boarding line, stood a man who didn't quite fit the usual mold of the wealthy travelers around him. While others wore expensive suits, designer watches, and carried luxury briefcases, Keanu stood calmly, wearing a plaid shirt, well-worn jeans, and a backpack that had clearly seen many miles. His boots were scuffed, his posture relaxed, and his gaze observant. Unlike the people around him, who constantly checked their phones or looked impatiently at the boarding gate, he seemed at peace, as if he had nowhere else to be but in that exact moment. Behind him, Richard stood with an entirely different presence. He exuded confidence, or rather, an arrogance that demanded to be noticed. His navy blue suit was pressed to perfection, his Italian leather shoes polished, so well they reflected the overhead lights. A luxury wristwatch peeked out from beneath his tailored cuff, and the subtle but unmistakable scent of an expensive cologne lingered in the air. Everything about him screamed wealth, success, and exclusivity. Richard surveyed the first-class line, nodding approvingly at those who, like him, belonged there: business executives, celebrities, and high-net-worth travelers. Then, his eyes landed on Keanu. His expression shifted instantly, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "First class, huh?" he muttered just loud enough for Keanu to hear, his voice laced with sarcasm. Keanu turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "The world is full of surprises," he replied simply, his voice calm and unaffected. Richard's smirk widened as he let out a soft chuckle. He had expected Keanu to stammer or appear uncomfortable, but instead, the man remained completely composed, as if the comment didn't faze him in the slightest. Richard wasn't the type to let things go so easily. He took a small step closer, lowering his voice slightly, but keeping the same condescending tone. "Nothing personal, but you don't seem like the type who flies first class," he said, gesturing subtly to Keanu's clothes and backpack. Keanu didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. Then, instead of engaging further, he just let out a small, polite smile. The line started moving forward. Without another word, Keanu stepped ahead, leaving Richard standing there, momentarily thrown off by the lack of reaction. He had been expecting some kind of defensiveness, maybe an excuse, but Keanu had given him nothing to work with. As Richard followed behind, he couldn't help but steal glances at the man in front of him. Something about Keanu felt off, not in a suspicious way, but in a way that Richard couldn't quite put his finger on. There was a quiet confidence in him, an ease that didn't match his appearance. Richard scoffed internally. Maybe he got lucky. Maybe someone gifted him a ticket. There's no way he belongs here. And yet, as they walked toward the plane, Richard had no idea that he was about to be proven completely wrong. The first-class boarding announcement echoed through the airport speakers, and the passengers in the exclusive line started moving forward. Business executives, celebrities, and well-dressed travelers adjusted their expensive carry-ons and prepared to step onto the jet bridge. Among them was Keanu, moving at his own relaxed pace, completely unbothered by the rush around him. Richard, standing just behind him, smirked to himself. He still couldn't wrap his head around the fact that this casually dressed man was flying first class. Maybe he won some kind of contest, he thought. Or maybe someone bought the ticket for him. As they reached the boarding agent, Keanu handed over his ticket. The agent scanned it, nodded politely, and gestured for him to proceed. Richard, with his confident stride, stepped forward right after him, handing over his own first-class ticket as if it were a badge of honor. Walking through the jet bridge, Richard felt the familiar thrill of entering a space meant for the elite. The moment he stepped onto the plane, the luxurious first-class cabin greeted him. Wide, plush seats, personal service, and the kind of comfort most travelers could only dream of. He smiled slightly, relishing the exclusivity. But then, as he glanced down at his boarding pass to confirm his seat, his confident expression faltered. Seat 3A. He lifted his gaze and scanned the cabin, moving down the aisle until his eyes landed on his seat. And that's when he saw it. Keanu was already there, settling comfortably into the seat right next to his. Richard stopped in his tracks for a moment, unable to believe it. His lips parted slightly in disbelief, his eyebrows drawing together. No way. Out of all the places on this plane, out of all the possible seat assignments, it had to be here. Keanu noticed a hesitation, looked up at him and gave a polite, knowing smile. "Looks like we're traveling together then," he said calmly. Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head as he stepped into the row. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. He sat down, placing his designer carry-on bag under the seat in front of him with just a little more force than necessary. He still couldn't believe his luck or lack of it. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering warm greetings and assisting passengers with their belongings. Richard leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, still processing the situation. He was used to first class being filled with people like him, powerful, wealthy, the kind of individuals who understood luxury. But this didn't make sense. After a few moments of silence, he turned to Keanu, still feeling the need to assert himself. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked casually, though the edge in his voice hinted at something more. Keanu, who had just finished adjusting his backpack under the seat, looked up with the same calm expression. "I work in film," he replied simply. Richard raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Small-time stuff?" he asked with a slight chuckle, already assuming the answer. Keanu just gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Something like that," he responded. Richard smirked, shaking his head slightly as he turned back toward the aisle. "Interesting," he muttered. The plane continued boarding, and the seats around them filled one by one. Yet, Richard couldn't shake the growing curiosity. Something about Keanu didn't add up, and soon he would find out just how wrong his assumptions were. As the flight took off, Richard couldn't resist striking up a conversation, though not in a friendly way. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because we have more inspiring stories coming your way. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked, his tone filled with curiosity, but also assumption. Keanu adjusted his backpack under the seat in front of him and replied simply, "I work in film." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Oh, commercials? Small-time stuff?" Keanu just smiled. "Something like that." Richard chuckled. "You know, not everyone is meant for first class. Some places just aren't for certain people." Keanu remained calm. "I believe we all end up where we're meant to be." The conversation was subtle, but the tension was growing. Other passengers were starting to take notice. The in-flight service began. When the flight attendant reached their row, Richard made sure to be noticed. "A glass of champagne, please. Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat." Keanu, on the other hand, simply said, "Just water, please." Richard scoffed. "Water? In first class? You're wasting the experience." Keanu took the bottle, looked at it, and replied calmly, "Sometimes simplicity is enough." Richard shook his head, smirking. That's the kind of thing people say when they settle for less. Passengers around them exchanged glances. Keanu, still unfazed, simply responded, "Maybe the best looks different for everyone." Richard wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone who didn't even seem to care. "Life is like flying first class," Richard said, swirling his champagne. You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. Some people are just lucky. Keanu placed his water bottle on the tray table and finally turned to Richard. Luck or hard work. In the end, we all land in the same place, don't we? The words hit harder than Richard expected. The cabin went quiet. A few passengers nodded in agreement. Just then, the flight attendant returned. Mr. Reeves, the captain wanted me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards. A wave of realization spread through first class. Richard froze. Reeves, he muttered. Passengers who had been quietly observing widened their eyes. Some even exchanged whispers. Richard turned back to Keanu, now looking at him as if seeing a ghost. You're Keanu Reeves. Keanu just smiled. Is something wrong, Richard? Richard stammered, trying to find the right words. I just didn't know. Keanu sighed. Richard, what you said doesn't change just because you know my name now. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. It depends on how you treat people. Richard sat in silence, the weight of Keanu's words settling in. The rest of the flight was quiet. Keanu read his book, completely unbothered. Richard, on the other hand, couldn't stop replaying everything in his mind. As the plane landed, Richard finally turned to Keanu. I need to apologize. Not because of who you are, but because I was arrogant. Keanu simply nodded. Take care, Richard. And with that, Keanu walked away, greeted by fans who approached him with warmth and admiration. Richard stood there, watching, realizing that true worth is not in wealth, but in kindness and humility. We often judge people based on appearances, assuming we know their worth. But as Keanu showed, true greatness isn't loud, it speaks through actions. So next time you find yourself in a moment of judgment, remember, respect and humility never go out of style. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because we have more inspiring stories coming your way.